Joining us right now via Zoom chat is Jonathon Van Maren. He is a speaker, a writer, pro-life activist. He's also the communications director for the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. You can also see a lot of his commentary over at LifeSite News as well. Good morning to you, Jonathon Van Maren.
Good morning to you.
Praise be to God. Before we jump into your book, The Culture War, came out in 2016, I believe. You're Canadian. What's your perspective on the truck rally that happened over the weekend?
Well, it's really interesting. I've been kind of waiting to see how everything plays out just because the convoy has turned into kind of a flashpoint of the frustration of everything going on at the same time. So it began to oppose the cross-border mandates, which of course I think all mandates forcing anybody to get something they don't want to get or bind their conscience in any way are evil. At the same time, I was just kind of wondering, okay, so how's this going to go just because the U.S. still has a mandate as well? So even if the Canadian government lifted it, they would still be stuck with the American mandate. But now it's turned really into this expression of frustration that millions of Canadians have had across the country. Neither of our political parties have really spoken up at all about any of these issues. And so the convoy has basically been a stand-in for the political valve that most people have for their frustrations in other countries. So it's been very interesting to see it play out. We've had a couple of days of peaceful protest in Ottawa, which was really encouraging to see. And now in the days to come, the truckers are saying they aren't going to leave until they get change. And so this is where things could get interesting because you can't get rid of these rigs with tow trucks.
It's a lot harder for sure. But, that's one of the things that came to my mind it's a great thing. I love to see the country come together like that. It's refreshing to see it. People are kind of sick of it all. But once the trucks are gone, it's business back to usual. I don't see this really having an effect long term. Do you think it really will? Or once this is over, it's over?
So that's what I think, and that's one of those. I haven't been saying it because you really don't want to pour cold water on enthusiasm, sure. Because they've really wanted, they've needed a public display that they are not some fringe minority, as Justin Trudeau says, and it's ironic because he literally runs a minority government that he got to form after receiving the smallest number of votes in Canadian history. So he should probably ease up on the minority talk. But no, the truckers put out this memorandum of understanding on their way to Ottawa, and almost everything in that memorandum of understanding is a fundamental misunderstanding of how the Canadian system works. Like most of what they were asking for couldn't be done by the people they were asking it of. Most of the mandates that they are against are provincial, not federal. So even if they got the prime minister to come out and meet with them, they wouldn't be able to get rid of those mandates. They need the premiers to meet with them and get rid of those mandates. So again, it was as an expression of frustration. As long as it stays peaceful and frustration doesn't mount in the Capitol and people get angry, it will have been a really magnificent way of showing the country that millions of people aren't on board. So right at this exact moment, I think the convoy has done a lot to let also politicians who are kind of on the fence know, look, you're speaking for a large group of people if you decide to have the guts to finally say something. Yeah. But if people are expecting the list of goodie items on the memorandum of understanding to actually happen, that unfortunately won't work. And the reason for this, right, is millions of people who never paid attention to politics are now paying attention to politics because politics is taking an interest in them, and it's led to a lot of misunderstandings. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's get over to the book because I think there is a link here, actually. The Culture War is the name of the book. Jonathon Van Maren is our guest. It came out in 2016, and one of my questions to you is, since you've written the book, how do you think we're doing on the Culture War front?
It's really interesting because I got asked to write a sort of a 5-year updated edition, and I thought that was way too soon. But I'll give you some good news and some bad news. The bad news is that when I wrote the book, I had about a page on the transgender issue, kind of explaining what it was all about. Right? Here, this is what transgender is, transvestite is. It was all these terms that were just becoming mainstream, and people needed to know what we were actually facing. Now, the trans thing would be at least a chapter because the gender ideology activists have more or less taken every Western institution by storm. Since I wrote the book, it's an incredibly short amount of time. I have a journalist friend who often says he feels 1,000 years old because that's how long it usually takes for cultural revolutions to accomplish this much. On the abortion front, of course, we have steadily managed to accomplish more, which has been really fascinating to see. The U.S. has been persistently encouraging because the book came out prior to the election of Donald Trump, which nobody saw coming. And at that point, the strategy was, let's get as many pro-life laws passed on the state level as possible. And over 350 of them were passed during Obama's tenure, which drove the abortion rate down to the lowest rate since Roe v. Wade in 1973. Now in 2020, we actually, it looks like we're going to be facing the fall of Roe. You know, we've gotten betrayed before, but a lot of people who are usually cynical, a lot of people who are usually pessimistic, like Dr. Robert P. George, Dr. Daniel K. Williams, people who generally urge caution are now bullish and are saying we think Roe's going to go. So I think we have to be cautious in our optimism, but the winning analysis on the ground right now is that the justices intend to overturn Roe v. Wade, which would be the culmination of almost literally 50 years of work.
We have just about a minute and a half before we have to go to a quick break with Jonathon Van Maren as our guest. The Culture War is his book. You can find it linked up on our social feeds. You can find it on Amazon and other places as well. But here's one of the thoughts that came to my mind is, it wasn't all that long ago when a lot of bishops and priests were hesitant to come out with the pro-life cause. They didn't preach on it. They didn't really want to mention it. They didn't want to rock the boat. Now I think that's changed. Many more bishops are happy to come out and support the pro-life movement, the anti-abortion movement in particular. I see that as a good trend. But very few of those same bishops would come out against the transgender ideologies or to support man and woman in marriage in the traditional sense. You got about 50 seconds or so. What would you say to that, Jonathon Van Maren?
Well, I think there's a certain amount of political analysis going on there, because we've lost on every major social issue, but on the abortion issue, we seem to be winning. It's a really bizarre state of affairs in that way. So it's always easier to side with the issue that transparently can be defended with science, without religion. And the trans activists are the most radical activists in town. So if you poke that bear, you're more likely to get hurt than if you state the position on abortion, which everybody's already aware of. So I think it's easier to speak out an abortion, ironically, than it is to say men can't get pregnant and women don't have penises.
Yeah, the truth, right? I mean, but so many people seem to be more married to their politics than they are to the Catholic faith.
Yeah, and they just don't, it's the same thing that we had when people wouldn't speak on an abortion. They have a misunderstanding of the words love and compassion. And those words have been hijacked by the LGBT movement, and they have to be taken back, by people who are willing to articulate the Christian position on these issues, or we'll keep losing.
Yeah, for sure. Now, we're talking about your book, The Culture War, and Alfred Kinsey is coming up. Now, this is a name that I would bet the vast majority of the audience probably has never even heard of. Mm-hmm. Who is Alfred Kinsey, and how is he linked to the culture war battle that we find ourselves in?
Well, Alfred Kinsey is someone I refer to in my book as the father of the sexual revolution, because really a lot of what has unfolded in America since the 60s can be traced back to his work. Now, he was a zoologist whose expertise actually lay in gall wasps, and if he'd stuck to that, we'd all be better off today.
Amen.
When he decided to branch off into the new field of sexology, he assembled a team in the 50s, or 40s and 50s, pardon me, and he began to interview thousands and thousands of Americans on their sex lives. And he released two major books, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. And these books essentially revealed to a stunned and somewhat titillated public that almost over 90% of Americans were, by the laws of that day and age, sex offenders. They were sex criminals. He basically said that almost no men were faithful to their wives, that the majority of men used prostitutes. Wow. The number of 10% of men having sex with other men. The famous claim of the gay rights movement comes directly from Kinsey. There's a lot of other stuff, excuse me, that it's simply too early in the morning to talk about that Kinsey revealed in his reports. Now, when this came out, you have to realize the impact that it had, because first, an entire generation of young people were essentially told that previous generations of Americans were lying to them. They were hypocrites. They had been told they were supposed to live one way, when in fact they had been living another way. It also questioned the veracity of the law, which seemed to be held in place by hypocrisy. What were the point of laws regulating sexual behavior if, in fact, nobody was living by these laws, and we just needed Kinsey to come along and break the conspiracy of silence. Then there was particularly horrifying data in his book tracking so-called child sexuality, and as it later turned out, this was discovered by Dr. Judith Reisman, who passed away last year. It was discovered that he had actually enlisted pedophiles to abuse children and then reported the reactions of those children as if they were sexual reactions. This data is still used essentially to justify sex education at very young ages, because it was Kinsey who first introduced the idea that we are sexual from birth until death. And as such, you need sex education all the way down to the youngest ages, preschool. So Kinsey had a profound impact on every aspect of American life. He had a profound impact on American law, on American family, on triggering the sexual revolution, on sex education in schools. And he led directly to a young man who read his reports and decided to launch in 1953 a pamphlet based on Kinsey's ideology called Playboy magazine. That young man was Hugh Hefner, and Hugh Hefner said that he was going to become Kinsey's pamphleteer. This is the Hefner who was from a strict Christian home, claimed to be actually directly descended from the Puritan governor of Plymouth, Massachusetts, William Bradford, who got off the Mayflower 400 years ago last year. And he decided that he was going to be living the Kinsey dream. So he abandoned his wife and got married, I don't know how many times by the time he finally passed away a couple of years ago. But Alfred Kinsey's the man who's had the most impact on your life that you've never heard of.
That is mind-boggling. How could this man collect, quote, sexual data, unquote, on children and not end up in prison?
Well, there's a whole bunch of interesting things, because basically we've discovered that the Kinsey reports are total junk. Dr. Judith Reisman actually was the one who discovered this, because as it turns out, back in the 40s, Americans weren't particularly up for discussing their sex lives with researchers and strangers. And so what they did was they junked the data that they didn't like. They classified sex criminals, homosexuals, women who are cohabiting with men as normal, average, everyday Americans, therefore hugely skewing the data to the conclusions they wanted, which is everybody's living lives of uninhibited hedonism. With children, essentially, there was just a chart that tracked the sexual reactions of children, and nobody asked the question, how did he get this data, until years later. They also found out that Kinsey, who presented himself as this sort of run-of-the-mill, average, moderate Republican, married, was actually engaging in wife swapping, shooting illegal pornos in his attic. He and his staff members were engaged in sadomasochistic bisexual relationships. Of course, he couldn't reveal any of this publicly because he had to, for the purpose of his political project, appear to be a sort of Eisenhower Republican sort of guy with a brown suit and a barbecue and a wife. But no, as it turns out, he was already living in private what he was espousing in public. And Judith Reisman is the one who has exposed him. And interestingly enough, the Kinsey Institute at the University of Indiana has been asked to release the data on the child sexuality many times. They will not, even though the entire purpose of the Institute supposedly is to preserve Kinsey's work for future generations of researchers. But they won't release the data. I suspect it's probably destroyed. Even there was a docudrama put out by Hollywood on Kinsey several years ago with Liam Neeson starring as Alfred Kinsey. Oh, wow. And even they had to make a reference to the pedophilia thing because it was becoming more well known. So they just show Kinsey interviewing this German pedophile who had supplied a lot of his data, and they show him as disgusted. But at the end of the day, he was just an uninhibited hedonist who tried to transform America and succeeded.
I'm sorry, Adrian, go ahead.
So yeah, just one question I had was, in regards to this whole thing, I can't help but think of the connection here between this and, one, the transgender movement, and two, the man-boy love movement that's being more and more popular today. I mean, we've seen secular outlets now releasing reports on, we have to be understanding, and people are born that way, minor attracted people. We can't say pedophile anymore. This idea, and it seems like this has its roots here. What can you tell me about the connection there between the modern LGBT movement and the new pedophilia movement that's re-arising?
Well, I think that it's fairly obvious that these movements are taking their initial evidence from Kinsey. He was the one who gave them the pseudoscience to claim that they were not just simply pursuing their own desires, they were trying to pursue an expression of themselves that could not be changed and that they could not help, right? If human beings are sexual till birth, you can suddenly claim that intergenital intimacy is a valid concept, right? And that's something that Kinsey put forward, that children were sexual from birth. He claimed, I don't even know how to say this on the radio, but put it this way. He claimed he was getting sexual responses from kids under the age of 1.
It's horrible.
Horrible. Now, if you're claiming that sort of thing, then how are you supposed to then claim that children don't want to be in sexual relationships if they're as sexual as post-pubescent adults are? So yes, this all originates with him. He was a horrible person. He actually died after causing himself an infection after piercing his private area with a nail to explore the boundaries between pleasure and pain. So he died as he lived, you might say, leaving America a much, much worse place when he did.
Mr. Van Maren, this whole conversation has been a shot, but I'd like to maybe have a chaser here and get your take as to what the solution is to this culture war, because these elements that we've spoken on just these past few minutes ago have been the seeds of destruction for our culture. But I want to get your take as to what the solution is to all of this.
Well, there's the optimistic way this could go, and there's the pessimistic way that this could go. And the optimistic way is that the report card on the sexual revolution has come in, and nobody's happy. Like the broken homes, the rates of sexually transmitted diseases. I track this in both Canada and the U.S. in my book. And if we want to talk about a real pandemic, we're going to start talking about the sexually transmitted diseases that have kind of ripped through generations of young people, but are now basically treated as the norm, right? It's normal for kids to get chlamydia. It's normal for kids to experience a couple of sexually transmitted infections, in the first couple of years of their sex lives, which begins younger and younger. So I think we need to reintroduce the concepts presented in theology of the body. I think that we need to aggressively point out that in a generation facing millions of questions, we actually do have the answers. We are presented here with a real opportunity, because when you tell kids they've been lied to today, they do believe it because they're not happy, right? The kid that grew up with parents who split up and convinced themselves it was for the kids. The kids wanted us to split up, and while we pursued our sexual interests with other people, when all kids really want you to do is knuckle under and stay together for them, right? Because you're the two halves of their world. Amen. Right? So kids know that they've been sold out, right? I do pro-life activism, and we go to high schools all the time, and the kids aren't sure we're right, but what they do know is they've been lied to their whole lives, because none of this is making them happy, right? They're digital addicts. They spend all of their time obsessed with pornography. A lot of them are losing their sexual function by the ages of 16 and 17. We have the highest rate of erectile dysfunction among young men under the age of 30 in recorded human history. Young men under the age of 30, I'm sure this is not news to any of you, didn't used to experience erectile dysfunction with any frequency. So the sexual revolution has functionally broken healthy sexuality, and we have the opportunity to explain why that happened and what the solution is.
It's a tough pill to swallow. I mean, to listen to this, but I think so many Christians have bought the lies of pornography in particular. We have about 1 minute left in our conversation. What would you say to men in particular who are holding on to pornography addiction? Jonathon Van Maren, about 60 seconds.
If you're holding on to pornography, you're part of the problem. If you're looking at pornography and you're married, you're cheating on your wife, and you're pumping sewage straight into your frontal cortex that is transforming your view of sexuality and rendering you incapable of doing any of the things that you need to do. You cannot be a good dad if you're looking at porn. You cannot be a good dad if you're a good wife, if you're a husband, if you're looking at porn. You cannot fulfill these rules because what you are engaging in is sexual cannibalism. You are consuming somebody else for your pleasure. It's completely one-sided, and it's essentially engaging in the material that's destroying us at the greatest frequency. There is no greater threat to our churches, our communities, our families, and our marriages than porn. And this is something that you need to deal with, and you need to get on top of that right now, because pornography it's so soul destroying. Amen. And I say this coming from hundreds and hundreds of conversations with wives, husbands, and their kids. I've seen what porn does. Get rid of it if it's in your house. If you can't handle not looking at it because you have a smartphone, smash the phone.
Amen. Well, we're out of time. Jonathon Van Maren, thank you for your time today. The Culture Wars, the book, you can find it linked up at Amazon.com. You can also find him and his blogs and other content at LifeSite News. Jonathon, God love you. God bless you. Have a great day.
Same to you.
All right, that's going to do it for hour number 1 of Catholic Drive Time.